Mr. Speaker, permit me this opportunity this afternoon to commence my presentation by acknowledging the people who have sent me to this honorable house term after term after term. Notwithstanding the efforts of those who failed the people and the attempt to hang on to the coattails of what they believe was legacy and pedigree, the people of Castries North said, "Not in Blue Wave City." And so, Mr. Speaker, they resoundingly returned me on this occasion to continue my task and my job of serving them with dignity, with integrity, and a sense of purpose and reason and cause for the plight of the people. But, Mr. Speaker, there is a famous verse, 1 Corinthians 13:11 in the Bible, which states, "When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up all childish ways." However, Mr. Speaker, in reality, that is not always the case. For there are some confused men, maybe childish, aliens to the truth, who will say, "Ever since I became a boss, I continued to speak like a child, to think like a child, to reason like a child, to believe like a child. When I become a child, I will give up all my mannish ways." Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, the two most recent sittings of this honorable House have brought to the fore some unimaginable, unbelievable, despotic, yet childish attitudes by some who have not awakened ever since they fell asleep to that bedtime story on the night of July 26, 2021. They are still sleeping. They wake up occasionally and they continue to behave like they are children. They have failed to realize that the authority once held no longer exists, except in their imagination, in Akai Bolo, in Tiroche, dubbed the People's Parliament. But the People's Parliament, Mr. Speaker, is here. And when we are called here to discuss the People's Parliament, if we are overseas, we must come down to serve the people in the Parliament and not play games, hide and seek like children, and then demanding who should stand, who should sit, who should talk, and whose game it is. In the Kaibolo, Mr. Speaker, the so-called People's Parliament, not even his sidekick in this honorable House was present to give him support. Not one chairperson presented themselves in the Kaibolo. But of course, the event must be held at the time, because there was need to hastily convene it to facilitate his takeoff in first class to witness Tiger Woods at the Masters tournament rather than to remain and to serve the people in the Parliament of this country. Mr. Speaker, I've highlighted all of this to say I have followed this Parliament for decades, as a child and as a man, in and out of government, and I have seen and experienced parliamentarians, prime ministers, and leaders of opposition behave spiritedly, boisterously, and that is spelled B-O-I-S, not B-O-I, and passionately in the advancement of the people's business. I lived, I saw these things, I participated, I admired. This country, Mr. Speaker, has experienced the dignity and humility of leaders who fell into opposition, like Sir George F.L. Charles, the champion of the working class, the erudite retired jurist, Sir Allen Louisy, the astute father of the nation, Sir John Compton, the hard-working and devoted Julian Hunt, Sir Julian Hunt, the learned Dr. Kenny Anthony, former leader and parliamentary representative for Vieux South, who just spoke. And there were others like Neville Snark, who crossed the floor, Verlon John, Reed George, who stood alone and championed the cause of the people of this country. Those were men who cared for their country. Those were men who cared for their people. There was Marius Wilson, unfortunately, Arson James, Marcus Nicholas, poor soul, Gail Rigobert, and the current Prime Minister, the Honorable Philip J. Pierre, who served with dignity and determination in this Parliament. You know, for the last 5 years, Mr. Speaker, that I served on the other side, all of the 5 budget presentations made by the then Prime Minister was responded to immediately by the then leader of the opposition, now the great Prime Minister of this country, Philip J. Pierre. He stood up, he was ridiculed, he was chastised, but he responded to the budget with great dexterity and information, and he served his people in that manner. Mr. Speaker, I too served as leader of the opposition, but never in the history of this Parliament has any of the leaders mentioned earlier ever quarreled, creating a public spectacle so profusely about his or her right to turn to speak or not to speak in this Parliament that is governed by rules. Notwithstanding, Mr. Speaker, our political differences of opinion, character, philosophy, and ideals, never before has there ever been so much baseless rhetoric about speaking order in a parliamentary system where each member has the right to speak, not to dictate. The right to speak, not to dictate, but in accordance with parliamentary rules, procedure, practice, and the standing orders of this Honorable House. As a servant of the people of St. Lucia, I am also proud to be part of this government which has a conscience, a soul, a purpose, and a cause. A government that cares for and about people, and a government of inclusiveness. I'm proud to be part of this government. Mr. Speaker, throughout my political career, to be exact, 41 years, serving at every conceivable level in the political party hierarchical structure and in government, in almost every ministry, in almost every public building, even though I saw the SLP as an adversary, I never saw them as an enemy. We all worked together. I remember giving in this parliament, Mr. Speaker, my very early years as minister, young minister of youth and sports. I was younger than Stephenson and younger than Jeremiah.
Member, be careful of calling members by name.
Oh, my apologies, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, I remember giving this story of I being Minister for Youth and Sports and Sir Julian Hunt being leader of the opposition. And the way we worked, every member on the opposite side then, and Sir Julian would call my phone, in those days no cell phone, call my phone at 6 o'clock in the morning or 5:30 in the morning, whatever time, very early, and he'd say to my mother, "Ko Steve, you got on me." And my mother, I used to say to her, "You are Julian Hunt's secretary," because she always reminds me, "Don't forget Mr. Hunt, don't forget Mr. Hunt." Mr. Speaker, I'm saying this to say the kind of camaraderie, the respect, the behavior, the respect that is required in the parliament. That's what existed. That's what existed. But, Mr. Speaker, I believe the time has come for a new kind of politics. Inclusive politics. A politics that always puts the people and the country first, and not ourselves as politicians. You know, I always say, in fact, that the way I lived before I got into politics, I continued in politics. I consider the road of politics to be a two-way street. One day I'm going up, one day I'm going down. I'll meet those who I pass on my way up, and they will receive me on my way down. And so we have to be humble, and we have to understand that this place is not our home. Mr. Speaker, the politics of today of this inclusive government is a politics that allows us to put the people and the country first. A politics of conscience. A politics in which we can disagree, debate, and arrive at the best solutions for our collective progress as a united nation and a people. But, Mr. Speaker, most significantly, I stand here in my unwavering support for the Appropriation Bill 2022-23, the budget address entitled Empowering Our People, Transforming Our Economy, as delivered by the Prime Minister and Minister for Finance, the Honorable Philip J. Pierre. Mr. Speaker, what defines this budget is not just the brilliant initiatives expressed by the Prime Minister, not just the programs, social programs presented by the Prime Minister, not just the subsidies on cooking gas or increase in personal tax allowances, not all the niceties that were presented by the Honorable Prime Minister, not all of the relief measures, but rather the cost statement in the introduction of the Prime Minister's statement, in which he said, "I want to begin my address by telling this Parliament and the people of St. Lucia who we are and what we stand for as a government." He went on to say, "This is very important, Mr. Speaker, so that the citizens of St. Lucia at home and in the diaspora understand what motivates and drives this government." Mr. Speaker, what motivates and drives this government has nothing to do with how we feel about each other, how we relate to each other, but all about our commitment to the cause of the people of this country. That is what it is about. The Prime Minister went on to say that at the core of our value system is the fundamental belief in social justice and wealth creation, a belief that every man, woman, and child should have an opportunity to reach their full human potential. And that statement, Mr. Speaker, is strong. It's meaningful. Because when we speak about opportunity for every man, every woman, and every child in this country to reach their full human potential, it speaks to the programs within the budget. Whether it's every family to have a university graduate, every school child to be able to receive support for government and their fees are paid, every child rather, can receive a laptop so he or she doesn't feel disadvantaged. Every family can know that there's a government who cares about them. And every family knows that a government who cares will provide them with food, clothing, and shelter. That is what this inclusive government is about. More so, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister went on to say, "My government intends to govern by the principles of inclusiveness, accountability, equity, meritocracy, and the rule of law so that corruption, wastage, and inefficiency are minimized." And so, Mr. Speaker, this last statement that I just made there from the Prime Minister is indeed the bedrock upon the reason why I am here today. This is why I am here on this side, on mission and in support of the policies, the principles of this government to govern by the principles of inclusiveness, accountability, equity, meritocracy, and the rule of law, so that corruption, wastage, and inefficiency are minimized. You know, yesterday, Mr. Speaker, when my good friend from Choiseul spoke, and he attempted to heavy lifting. So he has taken on Rodney Bay Road Improvement Project. And I said to him, do not go there. And he should listen to me, you know. Because this is not, Mr. Speaker, this is not the first time I've been warning this gentleman. He's my friend. You know, I'll say something about, I'll give him a break. But Mr. Speaker, he came with the Rodney Bay Road Improvement Project. At some stage, Mr. Speaker, I'll be making a formal report in this Parliament on Rodney Bay Road Improvement Project, on the National Roads Rehabilitation Project, and a number of projects which were undertaken under the last administration, which I was once part of. I have given the story of how this road started, and I know, Mr. Speaker, you may not want to give me another hour, but I'll try to at least précis what I'm about to say. And I notice the member from Miko South has disappeared. But I was invited one day, quite accidentally, to take a tour with the then Prime Minister to Rodney Bay, because he wanted to plant flowers. He wanted to put palms in Rodney Bay. He wanted to beautify Rodney Bay and to make Rodney Bay look like a more presentable community. I couldn't, beg your pardon? Yeah. So, Mr. Speaker, having invited me, I realized I couldn't do it, and so I sent the gentleman most qualified to go and see what flowers he needed, what garden plants, etc., to beautify Rodney Bay. The next thing I knew, an artistic impression of a road, a four-lane highway, with roundabouts where Rodney Bay came to my office and I said, this cannot work. No investigations, no scientific analysis,
Member for Castries North, you may continue, and we do apologize for that break in continuity. But you haven't lost any time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Although you have interfered with my stride. So, Mr. Speaker, I was speaking about the botanical engineer who assumed to be a civil engineer. So, Mr. Speaker, out of the blues, a drawing of a carriageway with 2 roundabouts, no scientific information to inform the design, no traffic studies or counts of traffic to inform the design. And so the intention was to proceed with the design or to proceed with the project. I advised against the intention to appoint the very gentleman to become the project manager on grounds of my own knowledge of his work. And I was overruled and direct instruction given to appoint the gentleman to be the project manager. On top of it all, Mr. Speaker, on top of it all, the gentleman refused, in contravention with the Works and Roads Act, to report to the chief engineer. Complete violation of the law. And so he was on his merry way with his bosses instructing him what to do and what not to do, how to do and how not to do. Went ahead building a roadway and not knowing what he is doing and doing anything that came to mind. So what have we ended up with, Mr. Speaker, on this project? A project that, upon review now, we have discovered that the consultant experienced serious challenges in finding information relating to the project. So in other words, no records were kept. Nothing to show that there was a design being followed and that, yes, the road was being done in accordance with the design. There was little correspondence, Mr. Speaker, issued by the then project manager. So how can you be the project manager and you're corresponding with nobody, very few individuals, and on the rare occasions when you corresponded, it was so scant you couldn't determine or decipher what exactly was going on the project. There was limited information on the scope of the project. Now, Mr. Speaker, you must understand that that project was what you call a design, finance, construct. Exactly what the member for Vieux South spoke on earlier. So there were no designs, no scope of works. Nothing can be found. The contractor never submitted the necessary design reports, nor the preliminary drawings, all of which were part of the contract. Never did that. No preliminary designs, no preliminary drawings, and no design reports. Obviously, Mr. Speaker, if you've got a contract to design, finance, and construct, the first thing you must have are the designs. So what are you building? It's like you gave somebody to build a home for you and you said, listen, design it for me, finance it, construct, I'll pay you later. And the contractor goes ahead and just starts building and he has not received your approval. So there were no approved designs for that road up there. Nothing. Total madness, Mr. Speaker. And that is why I'm saying to the member, do not come and defend matters if you do not have the necessary information to support you. Do not do this. Do not let people embarrass you. Then the contractor was being paid within 3 months of the commencement of the contract. Within 3 months, during the period of moratorium, that grace period that allows the government a little breathing space, a little relief, okay, on the person of the government, to allow the government to breathe. 3 months into the contract, hardly anything done. The contractor was already receiving money from the government. The chief engineer, as I said, never received the design report. The contract called for, Mr. Speaker, insurances, public liability insurance, accident insurance, if an accident happens on the project, that the government would have been indemnified. No insurance whatsoever. None. And then, Mr. Speaker, when it came to quality, disaster. Disaster. There was no quality plan, which is a requirement of the contract, where you must issue or present to the client, which is the government, your quality plan. Mr. Speaker, the projects you see going around the place, roads, etc., the requirements that they call for, and my honorable friend, learned friend from Vieux South spoke about, the efficiencies of government. Sometimes some of the requirements that are needed on projects are so tedious that they take time. But of course, some of this is steeped in persons just lazing around at times, etc., etc. So, no insurance, and the project is moving on, and persons' lives are endangered. There was no quality plan. So not even the ministry had given approval for the quality plan, because the gentleman is working on his own. He's not working for the ministry. The ministry is simply facilitating him. When he sends his claims, then they pay. The chief engineer has no control of him. The contract called for a quality manager or quality representative. No quality manager to test the strength of the concrete, to test the sub-base and the base of the road. None of that, Mr. Speaker. There was no mixed design. You don't build a road until the ministry receives your mixed design, put it to the test in the lab, and then say to you, go ahead. Otherwise, you may have a contractor building a road for you, and within 3 weeks the road disappears, or the wall collapses, etc. So they never adhered to the conditions of the contract. No mixed designs were found. They never presented any mixed designs on taking over the project. And when other quality evidence and cubes showed up, there were serious concerns. In fact, Mr. Speaker, in a number of cases, what was being recommended, Mr. Speaker, was that some of the walls be demolished because of the failure of the quality of the material that was being used on those walls. In a number of cases, it is recommended that those walls be demolished. As of now, yes, as of now, that those walls be demolished. So, Mr. Speaker, these are the things that we speak of. These are the things that this government is saying we cannot tolerate, we must not tolerate, and we must do all within our ability and our power to ensure that we do not allow such behavior to continue. Mr. Speaker, when we speak about equality and opportunity for all, every man, every woman, and every child, okay, to have an opportunity to reach their full human potential. I'm reminded, Mr. Speaker, of Cabot, a development project for which the government granted concessions to undertake in this country. But, Mr. Speaker, later on in my presentation, you'll understand what we are trying to do to avoid what transpired in that particular project, where the people were saying that we need to enjoy the resource of this nation. We need to have access to the assets of the state. And don't just give it away. Don't just throw it away. But we need to enjoy it. We need to get to the beach. Our children need to get to the beach. And I must say personally, Mr. Speaker, this is not a position of the government. I personally felt very insulted when the NIC was approached to finance that project, and it was approved. Having been approved, after a few months, they were able to speculate and to be able to raise the money based on sales and to pay back the NIC in quick time. I felt it was really a prostitutional act of the NIC by those investors. Because I know, Mr. Speaker, there are a number of St. Lucians who would love to access the NIC to build a home, a little home for themselves, to create that shelter that they all deserve. But their pension funds were used to facilitate this development. And so the Department of Planning and Physical Development is paying close attention to ensure that the development is kept in accordance with the incentives they are given and they don't violate the assets of the people of this country. Mr. Speaker, at some other stage, I will speak on the issue of DSH, or probably I should leave this to the Minister for Investment. But this, Mr. Speaker, again, is another project which has affected the people of this country. The road, Mr. Speaker, which was built in Vieux-Fort, the realignment of the Larissus Road. Mr. Speaker, that road originally, we were told, would have been paid by the investor. Would have been paid by the investor. The contractor who was selected to do the road didn't go through the due diligence of the ministry, was handpicked and issued a contract without the involvement of the government. But yet still, the road ended up on our books as a debt of the state. C.O. Williams built the road, but C.O. Williams was the contractor long before the ministry knew that the road was supposed to be built. These are the kind of things which happened. And you ask me why I did what I did? You ask me why I did what I did? What I did was to free myself of wrongdoing around me. It's to allow me to exhale and to have no guilt. To have no guilt that what was going on was wrong and against the will of the people. I needed to stand out and stand up and say enough is enough. So when you hear them talking, they're on the radio, and you know, I speak of radio, Mr. Speaker. Sometimes I'll go off and on. I speak of radio. You know what is sad, Mr. Speaker? When you take all that happened in the last 5 years and you juxtapose it on what really should have been done, you say to yourself, this must never ever happen again in this country of ours. Mr. Speaker, for 5 years we came to this parliament, every sitting, and they refused to appoint a deputy speaker of the House. Refused. One collapsed. Did no arrangements The law called for it and didn't do it. And trying to compare us with Antigua and some other countries, we don't compare ourselves with Antigua. And I'm sure the member of Youth for South will endorse me on that. Absolutely. If we compare ourselves, let's compare ourselves with a reputable place. Okay? Let us do that. A good record. 5 years without a Speaker of the House. 5 long years. And so, Mr. Speaker, I'm saying these things because it pained me, it was painful, and it was only a matter of time to move out and move on. Mr. Speaker, I'll move on to another subject. And on this case, again, I'll refer to the Prime Minister's statement in which he said, at the core of our value system is a fundamental belief in social... No, I've done this already. Okay. I'll move on, Mr. Speaker, and to quickly run through some of the initiatives of the Ministry of Infrastructure, Ports, Transport of this government. The Department of Infrastructure, Ports and Transport, Mr. Speaker, which also encompasses energy, is fully committed to the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. Mr. Speaker, the implementation of these initiatives, international agreements, requires significant investment to achieve the SDGs and the updated nationally determined contributions pledged by St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, to achieve these critical targets, infrastructure must be significantly bolstered in every sphere: roads, air and seaports, transport, water, sanitation, energy and telecommunications. In response, Mr. Speaker, the Ministry of Infrastructure, Ports, Transport, Physical Development and Urban Renewal has commenced the process of developing for implementation an infrastructure plan dubbed Infrastructure 2030. Therefore, Infrastructure 2030 will create the nexus for a symbiotic relationship between the departments of infrastructure, ports, transport, energy, physical development, and urban renewal towards the harmonization of that vision for the country's socio-economic and sustainable development agenda as we advance into the future. Mr. Speaker, the program will focus on the renewal and expansion of existing road infrastructure to support growth in such sectors as tourism, housing, health, education, agriculture, labor, and production. The plan will propel the development of a modern road network, linking and creating new communities, settlements, and zones of economic activity, while at the same time renew our urban and intercity communities. Consequently, Mr. Speaker, a renewed thrust will be initiated towards identifying suitable areas across the spectrum of our urban communities which merit serious consideration for enhancement. The development, Mr. Speaker, and modernization of our air, seaports, and maritime infrastructure, in tandem with the modernization of the transportation sector, particularly public transportation. The transformation of the telecommunications sector into the electronic communications modality to capture the rapid increase in technology, the upsurge in online services, and faster communications need, thereby fostering economic growth and development and the transformation of an ultra-modern and smart society. Mr. Speaker, energy, the evolving transformative driver for economic growth, will be bolstered to respond to our national needs and in keeping with our international commitments. To underpin all these initiatives, Mr. Speaker, the overall physical development and renewal of our landscape.
Member for Castries North, you have 15 minutes left.
Okay.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to rise under Standing Order 3210 to provide the member for Castries North with an additional half hour.
Honourable members, the question is that Standing Order 3210 be invoked to suspend Standing Order 32.8 to allow the member for Castries North an additional 30 minutes. And now put the question, as many as of that view say aye.
Aye.
As many of a contrary opinion say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Please proceed, member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'll move quickly on to major projects being undertaken, and therefore permit me to highlight some critical initiatives across the broad spectrum of portfolios within the two departments in my ministry. The major projects being undertaken by the Department of Infrastructure, Mr. Speaker, includes the continuation of the West Coast Road reconstruction project. And many times, Mr. Speaker, you'd hear comments like, well, they have stopped projects. They have stopped the Rodney Bay. They have stopped this one. This government is not about stopping projects, Mr. Speaker. It's about reviewing ridiculous projects and making sense of them afterwards. The cul-de-sac bridge construction project, Mr. Speaker, by the government and people of Japan and administered by JICA, that is proceeding, Mr. Speaker. The unique thing about this project, Mr. Speaker, it's one which spans probably 3 administrations. After Thomas, the Japanese came and did their assessments and showed interest in the situation in the valleys, followed by the Labour administration in 2011 when all of the studies were done and the government embraced their offer. This project, Mr. Speaker, should be completed early next year, and the whole cul-de-sac basin will be certainly transformed with the Millennium Highway and the project of the bridge in cul-de-sac beginning to open up the cul-de-sac valley for greater activity. The Mark and Dennery Community Roads project, Mr. Speaker, under Design Finance Construct, that, Mr. Speaker, is ongoing, and we'll hopefully be able to complete once we have been able to complete our reviews on those projects. Castries, Viewfort North and South, and Labrie Road improvement projects, those, Mr. Speaker, this week, next week are rolling out. So the member for Castries South, your roads will be on the way next week. Viewfort North, we have already started work in Viewfort North, and there are a number of roads which we have down for Viewfort North, and Labrie also will get this. The Millennium Highway, Mr. Speaker, which is part of the UK CIF, the second package of tenders have gone out for package 1 and 2, package 2 and 3. Package 2 is the section from Canneries to Ancillary, which includes the construction of a new ancillary bridge, and package 3 is some ancillary to Soufrière. Package 1 is really the Millennium Highway and the roundabout. Mr. Speaker, also under the Ministry of Infrastructure, we have a number of other projects which we are proceeding with, road improvement maintenance programs, as part of the government's thrust to improve on our road infrastructure. One of the roads, Mr. Speaker, which will soon be approved based on the speed at which negotiations are going is the Castries-Grosley Highway. That project, Mr. Speaker, was one of the projects which was on the table in 2016, but for whatever reason, the last administration decided not to even look at it, but to abandon it and to move on and to allow the road to deteriorate in the manner it has deteriorated. Mr. Speaker, we have been successful in negotiating with the Kuwaitis. We have spent quite a bit of time in the last few weeks negotiating with them, and they have in principle agreed to give favorable consideration to the improvement of the Castries-Grosley Highway to create a four-lane highway and to look at the other subsidiary roads. That road, Mr. Speaker, also, the Cabinet of Ministers has already agreed and approved the renaming of the segment of the Castries-Grosley Highway from the Shock Bridge into Grosley, and we're hoping that come August 1st that a ceremony will be held on Emancipation Day to emancipate the minds of the people on this particular road. Mr. Speaker, I move on to energy quickly, and the ministry is committed to its mission of lowering energy prices while maintaining a reliable service with an overall decreased dependency on imported fuels. Mr. Speaker, we are proceeding, and we are hoping that very soon the Integrated Resource Resilience Planning Program will be launched so as to move ahead in meeting our deadlines for renewable energy. Mr. Speaker, under the World Bank NDC support facility, the government of St. Lucia, through the Department of Infrastructure, is receiving support towards the revision of the 2010 National Energy Policy, commonly called the NETS. That policy, Mr. Speaker, which was developed in 2010, really is the blueprint, the roadmap towards energy sustainability. Having been around for 12 years, having made some progress, and of course in the advancement that is taking place within the energy sector, it is felt that there's need for review and to move on quickly with the program. Mr. Speaker, regarding Hironora International Airport, we have been able to raise funds for the solar carport at the Hironora International Airport, and that is as a consequence of discussions held with the United Arab Emirates under the Caribbean Renewable Energy Fund, CREF, to implement the following. It includes a 430 kilowatt solar carport at Hironora International Airport, 26 solar street lights to be installed at an unlit portion of the parking area at HIA, and 2 level 3 electric vehicle chargers at the solar port at HIA. All of this, Mr. Speaker, is intended and targeted to reduce the cost of operations at Hironora International Airport to save them money. Mr. Speaker, we were able 2 years ago, or not 2, but rather 3 years ago before COVID, we were able at one of our meetings in the UAE to negotiate a $15 million US loan for the establishment of a 10 megawatt solar farm with battery storage project. This one is an upgraded facility, and so we're able, through the Abu Dhabi Fund for Development, through the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, they have approved the loan of $15 million US, and LUSLEC has of course been invited to participate in this project, in a joint project where government will be called upon to guarantee this loan. This is towards the establishment of the farm with battery storage in Tumase, Miku. The 10 megawatt solar PV and 7 megawatt battery storage project is the largest of its kind on the island for approximately US $30 million in all. Mr. Speaker, let me move on quickly considering the time. Approval also of renewable energy sector development project. This, Mr. Speaker, is indeed a very important project to us in St. Lucia, and I'm sure the parliamentary representative for Soufrière will have much interest in this one. It is a project which will cost US $21.9 million for renewable energy sector development. The development objective of this project, Mr. Speaker, is to inform the government of St. Lucia on the viability of its geothermal resource for power generation to create the enabling environment to scale up renewable energy investments with the private sector. Mr. Speaker, for years, St. Lucia has been attempting to explore geothermal as far back as the 70s when the first wells were drilled. In the 80s, some further development took place, and ever since, we have been on that road to geothermal energy. It is my hope that on this occasion, that we will be able to find geothermal in sufficient capacity to be able to supply the communities and to reduce the cost of electricity. The project has two components. Component one comprises all activities related to the geothermal exploration drilling of 3 to 4 slim wells, not like the old wells, huge wells, but slim wells in Belle Plaine, Fort Saint-Jacques, Soufrière, and Mont-Lézard in Mondaisy in Saltibus to assess and confirm the viability. Component 2, Mr. Speaker, includes a technical assistance program aimed at 1, increasing the government of St. Lucia's capacity to implement the project, and 2, strengthening St. Lucia's regulatory framework for renewable energy integration, and 3, supporting a reduction in the employment gender gap in the energy sector, and I'm sure the Minister for Gender Relations will be very pleased to know that there is a component for the women in this project. The project, Mr. Speaker, will be implemented over a 4-year period, 2022 to 2026. Mr. Speaker, the Project Implementation Office unit has already been established. We are working with the World Bank. Project staff is being recruited, advertised for and to be recruited. And the next steps, Mr. Speaker, is for parliamentary approval of the borrowing related to the Renewable Energy Sector Development Program, the signing of financing agreements by Minister of Finance, continue hiring of the project staff, the launching of the project, and of course preparation of office space. One of the components of this project, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that the World Bank is giving us a $15 million US dollar grant for exploration. But the good thing about it is if indeed there is sufficient capacity, then that grant is transformed into a loan. If there's no capacity, then it's a grant. Mr. Speaker, I will move on through energy and go to, well, still on energy, but to look at the issue of the electricity bill and its regulations. One of the concerns we've had in this country, Mr. Speaker, over there is the cost of production, the cost of manufacturing, how much it costs us in this country, the energy cost, and our inability to be able to compete with other countries such as Trinidad and Tobago, which has a resource of oil and the ability to be able to produce at a cheaper rate. Now that we're pushing renewable energy, and there's a tremendous appetite among persons who are in that field, whether it is wind, solar, or geothermal, the need has come, Mr. Speaker, to break the monopoly, hopefully, based on legislation, and to be able to allow other energy producers to get in the mix. The reason for this, Mr. Speaker, is that LUSLEC is the owner, is rather the generator and distributor of electricity. They own the generating plant, they own the infrastructure for distribution, whether it's the poles, the lines, the generators, etc., etc. They own all of this. if we are to allow persons to participate, whether it's on your home where you're doing your own generation for your own use, or it's in your business, or it's a freestanding commercial activity, there is need, if we're going to allow persons to sell back to the grid, there is need to have the proper legislation to be able to do this. We have been discussing the legislation, Mr. Speaker, for the last 4 years. We have received assistance from the World Bank, and we are finally in a position, Mr. Speaker, where we are nearing the completion, with the support of the Attorney General's chambers, nearing the completion of the review of the legislation, the new legislation, with just a few minor amendments to be made to ensure that it is brought to this Parliament sooner than later. My intention is that the legislation comes to the Parliament hopefully before the second half of this year, so as parliamentarians can debate it and for passage, and to be able to open the gates for investors to come in and to participate in this initiative. This also gives, Mr. Speaker, locals the opportunity to be able to invest in PVs in their homes, their photovoltaic facilities, to generate their own electricity. And if they're able to generate more than they deserve, then they can sell back to the grid, to Loosleg, and to pay the difference between what they sell and what they consume. Mr. Speaker, there are some new policy initiatives being undertaken this year, Mr. Speaker, one of them being the Electronics Communications Bill. And for those of you who recall, sometime in 2000, the then Minister for Communications, Mr. Calix George, championed the cause to liberalize the telecommunications system here in St. Lucia. As a consequence of that, he was able, with the support and cooperation of other countries and other ministers in the region, was able to break the monopoly and to allow participation of other companies, some of whom are still around in the sector. This time around, because of the industry, the sector growing, and communications is now being more electronics than anything else, there's need for a new electronics communication bill so as to be able to stay on top of the development situation. There is also a project, the National Emergency Telecommunications Plan, the National ICT Policy and Implementation Strategy, the Meteorological Policy and Legislation, as meteorological is also on the meteorology rather, is also under the Ministry of Infrastructure. Revised National Energy Policy, which I spoke earlier on, the Electricity Bill, and the Integrated Road Sector Policy and Strategic Roadmap, the Sustainable Road-Based Public Transport, Gender-Sensitive Road Safety Campaign, and International Ship and Yacht Registry. The International Ship and Yacht Registry, Mr. Speaker, is one that my colleague to my left is very, very excited about. She has been speaking about it. She went to Dubai, and I believe she was working the floor throughout that visit to Dubai, attempting to get the interest of persons in Dubai who have expressed a tremendous amount of interest in the whole setup of a ship and yacht registry. But the setup of the ship and yacht registry, Mr. Speaker, will also be done in parallel with the establishment of a maritime sector, maritime institute, where we will begin to set up a known, established maritime affairs infrastructure that will now be on its own without SASPA being the one operating as both regulator and operator. The Electronic Communications Bill, I have spoken to this one, Mr. Speaker, and very soon it will come to Parliament and for passage by members of Parliament. I want to move on, Mr. Speaker, and to deal with some other matters under my portfolio. And this one, Mr. Speaker, has to do with the redevelopment of Hironora. The objective, Mr. Speaker, of the redevelopment of HIA is really to alleviate the congestion during peak arrival times. We have, Mr. Speaker, as a consequence of the intention of the government to be able to realize fiscal space, an audit was done, and we're hoping very soon we can come to the Parliament and to get guidance, or to rather present to the Parliament the intentions of the government moving forward. Mr. Speaker, moving on, I will go on to the Department of Physical Development. And this department, Mr. Speaker, is a department which is very much involved in the overall landscape of this country, developing the country and, of course, ensuring that the regulatory arm maintains the development that is acceptable in St. Lucia. The Department, Mr. Speaker, of Physical Development and Urban Renewal has a number of new strategic policy initiatives that have been identified by this new administration. One of them, Mr. Speaker, is the updating of the regulatory framework to respond to emerging scenarios in the realm of physical development by reviewing the legislation, acts and regulations for the Architects Registration Act, Land Registration Act, and Physical and Planning Development Act to include regulations and building codes. Mr. Speaker, you heard the member for Vieux South when he spoke of the land registry and some of the challenges at the land registry, but more so the potential of the land registry as a haven for much needed information by locals and foreigners also. The land registry is an asset to this country. Not only the fact that, as the member said early on, we can raise more money by charging fees for copies of documents, but in there, Mr. Speaker, at the land registry is a resource of information that can be offered to the professional sector, the professional bodies, for use in their profession, for, of course, for payment of a fee. That, Mr. Speaker, will help us in modernizing the department, to make the department a lot more efficient, and to be able to respond in a even more timely manner to the needs of the people of this country. You noted, Mr. Speaker, as I presented, I also included the need for building codes, which we should review under our regulations. And I'm getting the nod from the member for Castries Southeast, because this is a subject, it is his area, professional area, but this is a subject we have spoken on many occasions. The need for us to improve the building codes here in St. Lucia and to make sure that we are above the rest and that we are keeping up with times and what the challenges, the environment is challenging us to do in this country. So these we shall look at. Mr. Speaker, the other one we are looking at in this financial year, new initiative, is the policy position paper and that is being compiled to enhance the administrative and regulatory function of the Development Control Authority, that is the DCA, to better manage emerging models of developments that have substantial impact on the environment generally. These comprise subdivision policy and quarry policy. Mr. Speaker, among others, Mr. Speaker, subdivision policies in this country, land subdivision, is a very critical issue. Too often, developers have gone ahead, developed their plans, take it to the DCA, ask the DCA to release 5 lots. The lots are released. They go in, they sell, do not put in the infrastructure, but continue to develop and get another 5 lots. Approval is granted. And at the end of the day, the entire development is completed and the infrastructure is not in place. This then becomes a burden to the government because development, subdivisions must be built in its entire structure, construct. It's land, it is road up to the standard of the Ministry of Infrastructure, it is utilities, water, telephone, electricity, and the government then inherits the infrastructure once it meets the standard. But too many developers, Mr. Speaker, are escaping the established standards set by the government as a consequence of going through loopholes which allow them the opportunity to get 5 lots approved with the understanding that they'll put in the infrastructure. This, Mr. Speaker, must stop. The policy on quarry, Mr. Speaker, we have no quarrying policies. There are quarries all over St. Lucia, but there are no policies. People are exploiting the resource of the land, and we have no policies. Quarries sometimes appear in different locations, close to residential settlements, and so we need to put a proper policy in place that regulates the operations of quarries, and to ensure that since it is a mining process, that the government should be able to draw some kind of, dividends from the establishment of the quarries. Mr. Speaker, the other burning issue which we are looking at in this as we speak is the burning issue of Queen's Chain. We are moving forward, Mr. Speaker, to formulate a policy on Queen's Chain to assist in governing and managing the use of Queen's Chain, including addressing matters like leases, rental rates, length of lease, public access and assignment, etc. Mr. Speaker, this is so important. Important to the extent of the preservation of the asset of the state for use by the people, but also to regularize some of the policies within the whole question of management of Queen's Chain, the whole question of leases. When you look at the Queen's Chain leases, Mr. Speaker, they vary from one to the next at extremes. So in some cases you may find someone with equal, so there's no distinction in many instances as to what is the rental rate for Queen's Chain which sits over a cliff and what is the rental rate for Queen's Chain which sits on the beach. And so we need to look at those things and to be able to have a fair policy that will benefit all who may wish to lease Queen's Chain, including St. Lucians. And we must never ever believe that Queen's Chain are to be leased out to foreigners. We must never ever believe that. Mr. Speaker, the fourth initiative is that of identifying suitable areas across the spectrum of our urban communities which merit serious consideration for enhancement under the urban renewal portfolio. Mr. Speaker, we have had the whole portfolio of urban moved around and change of names being made. One time it's urban development, another time it's urban renewal, and it keeps moving around. And what has been happening, Mr. Speaker, over the years, it gets lost in the structure of government. It is not fully financed in a way that we can benefit from it. And so what we're looking this time around is the need to look at the whole aspect of urban renewal and to start off first by engaging in some pilot projects that will show the benefit of urban renewal. One of those pilot projects, Mr. Speaker,
Member for Castries North, you have 15 minutes left.
Thank you very much, sir. One of the pilot projects, Mr. Speaker, we're looking at is in Grosley, in a place called, what's it, Monsepan. In that Monsepan area, Mr. Speaker, a beautiful area, an area that the parliamentary representative loves, but it's an area where the people don't own the land, though it is on private property. They have squatted, they've been living there for many years, and now we believe we can move in and regularize the land and to allow the persons to be able to have a piece of St. Lucia for themselves. Mr. Speaker, another vexing area that we need to look at is the area of Cronglands. Cronglands, Mr. Speaker, over the years has been a department. Of course, the intention of Cronglands, Mr. Speaker, is really and truly to preserve and protect the assets of the country. However, based on leadership, etc., it has become sometimes a land development company. Sometimes it's a commercial entity selling land. And so I believe, Mr. Speaker, we need to look at Cronglands and to be able to put a proper administrative and policy framework in place, and most likely to be headed by a full commission that will be able to handle Cronglands in a more meaningful manner. This, Mr. Speaker, certainly will allow us to review and reform the structure and function of the Cronglands Department to optimally benefit from the existence of significant and scarce land resources. Mr. Speaker, I will end here and to state that this budget, Mr. Speaker, has presented to us an insight into what this government stands for. You notice, Mr. Speaker, in this budget, it is heavy on social programs, yet dynamic on serious investment by a government who understands how to balance investment and social programming. I have no doubt, Mr. Speaker, by the aggression of the Prime Minister, the Minister for Investment, by the enthusiasm of the Minister for Youth and Sports, Minister for Equity, by the determination and tenacity of the Minister for Commerce, who never lets up, by the competent hand of the Minister for Labor, who is determined to ensure that the industrial climate is in such a way that our people can feel confident of a fair day's wage for a fair day's work for a fair day's wage. By the dependability on the Minister for Health, who has proven, despite all, when they sought to ridicule him and to ridicule the Prime Minister, when the numbers were going up, celebrating and boasting, they showed that with commitment, with determination, with focus, that we can all do it. Mr. Speaker, I know with us here there are men and women who are working. Young Gerard, who is in the Ministry of Economic Development and Finance, managing in there and ensuring that the programs are delivered. Our Minister for Agriculture, who delivered yesterday, Mr. Speaker, and showed that it's not by saying "Nukai voye fig en France," but by standing up and putting the programs in place, and when it is necessary, to accompany the shipment to its destination as a sign of commitment. Mr. Speaker, there are men and women on this side who are committed. I just noticed, Mr. Speaker, the Minister for External Affairs, whose job, and I guess he has just landed, and obviously it appears to be a perfect landing because he looks great on the other side, on the tarmac. But you know, the determination also of the Minister for External Affairs and his desire to utilize strategically the diplomatic connections to the benefit of not just the people, not just the government, but rather to the people and the country called St. Lucia. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, when our children this year will look back and find that the parents are less worried as to how they send the kids to school. Can they pay for school fees? Can they provide meals for them? Will they have transportation? And the exam fees, the Minister of Education, Mr. Speaker, has proven in there that he has what it takes in this budget. And if you think it's all over, Mr. Speaker, the man himself who dislodged the last Minister for Education, in great style, notwithstanding, Mr. Speaker, his challenges, he showed that when you are committed to working for the people, nothing stops you from working for the people. And the member, I'm proud of him, young and energetic, notwithstanding the challenges that he has gone through, Mr. Speaker, he has kept to the cause. He has committed himself. And as a soldier, he has shown us what it is, what it means to be committed to the people of this country. Mr. Speaker, in supporting this budget, I want to give great, commendation to the Prime Minister of this country. Mr. Speaker, there was a need for me, Mr. Speaker, and I hope you give me an opportunity. There's a need for me in my 40th year as a politician to decide, what do I do? Do I run away and allow things to fall by the wayside? And for the people of the country to ask, what are you doing and what did you do? I took up the challenge and said, I will do it alone. I said to them who felt that I betrayed them, I am going on my own. I have served my time, and I believe the people must judge me by my own values. I did it, and I won. An offer, an olive branch was extended to me to work in the interests of the people and the country. I accepted it. And so many times, Mr. Speaker, people would continue to ask me, why did you leave the UWP? The answer I've given from day to day to this day is that the UWP, under the joint leadership of one called Alan and Guy, had become treacherous to the country and had betrayed the core principles and values of the UWP that I knew and believed in. It had become traitorous to the father of the party, Sir John Compton. I recall, Mr. Speaker, at the cabinet retreat in 2018, I warned the cabinet that the UWP had lost its way and was no longer the party that I recognized, that the party I joined in 1981 as a young man. I stayed till...
Remember, you have 5 minutes left.
In the 5 minutes, Mr. Speaker, I stayed in the bitter end in the vain hope that I could have influenced the party to return to its founding principles, but alas, that was not to be. I therefore made my patriotic move calculated to cause maximum damage to prevent a treacherous and traitorous group of politicians from causing more harm to this country. I am and have always been a citizen politician, not a narrow-minded party political hack. I believe that the UWP that I once knew was a better vehicle to deliver a framework of peace and prosperity for all. Throughout my political career, Mr. Speaker, the SLP has always been my adversary. I remain independent of the SLP. I thank the Prime Minister for having seen the need and the merit in having that government of inclusion and for embracing me, and my independence in the cabinet, where I am happy, where I am comfortable, and where there are men and women who love the country and Mr. Speaker, I believe we have inherited St. Lucia in a critical situation, not being side-railed or distracted by the boast of 12% increase in economic activity. I ask you, Mr. Speaker, if only that government had done what is right, today they would not have been boasting of 12%. They would have been boasting of 42%. Because just imagine, $7 million being spent on vaccines we have never seen and may not ever see, on a company that the then Prime Minister stated that I did my due diligence. I know the man, but I didn't know if he was the owner or a worker. But what kind of reckless government, Mr. Speaker, is this? If there was ever time, Mr. Speaker, but I had to assess my decision is now. And my decision now, Mr. Speaker, is that I made the right move. So, Mr. Speaker, in closing, I'm proud to have been given that opportunity for the first time to participate in this historic event of the first budget of the Honorable Philip J. Pierre. A man of his word, a man of commitment, a man with conscience, a man who loves, and a man who is determined to provide for the people of this country. It is my first as a member of a Labour Party government. It's the first inclusive government. Mr. Speaker, I therefore pledge my full support for this budget of the people and for the people, and one in which the people are truly first on the agenda of this government of the St. Lucia Labour Party. I hereby unwaveringly support the 2022-2023 appropriation bill, and I look forward to its passage and its implementation in the coming months. I thank you.